I'm going to speak in English. I was told that it was okay. First, I want to thank the Inter-American Institute for Democracy for the invitation and for holding this event, and greet the panelists, many of whom I've known for a long time, and to also salute them for their courage to come to Washington and to expose the violations of civil liberties and human rights that are taking place in Ecuador today. Very briefly, my perspective is different, of course, not being an Ecuadorian, not having been involved directly in the struggle that these gentlemen are continuing to carry on. My perspective is that of an American former government official and someone who still looks at the region as one that we should be paying a lot more attention to. So what I'd like to do to perhaps put in context some of the examples that have been given here today about the abuse of power by the government of Rafael Correa, let me just give you some of the examples of a few very brief examples of some of his activities against the interest of the United States, and that our government, believe me, our government is very much aware of. It may not publicly state and restate what we all know, but it keeps it in mind and forms part of the policy formulation process. Since he assumed power in 2007, Correa's government has been characterized by a virulent anti-Americanism for whatever reasons. We can get into whatever psychological reasons are behind that, or family, or whatever. It doesn't matter. The fact is that from the standpoint of a U.S. Government, we have to look at the actions of a government official or a government like Correa's, which, for example, in 2009 closed or ordered the U.S. air base, which was in Manta, Ecuador, which is the largest anti-narcotics surveillance base in the Andes region. He ordered it closed. It was eventually closed. That base always took pains, the United States government took pains to make sure that the sovereignty of Ecuador was never violated. Every flight had an Ecuadorian captain aboard. Nothing was done without the express approval of the Ecuadorian government. So if Mr. Correa, one of the excuses he used was it violated the sovereignty of Ecuador. That is simply not true. In fact, it helped the sovereignty of Ecuador by defending it against the violations of that sovereignty by the drug cartels. In January of 2009, he closed something called the UIES, the Unidad de Investigaciones Especiales, which was a special investigative unit of the police that had the support of the United States government. This unit had very high professional standard, had been vetted against corruption, something that was affecting the police, perhaps still is. Along with closing that unit, Correa expelled 2 American diplomats assigned to the embassy that were dealing with the special services, a special investigative unit. In April 2011, he expelled U.S. Ambassador Heather Hodges on the allegation that she had insulted the country by pointing out in a classified cable, which was leaked, that there was corruption in the highest levels of the police department. Ambassador Hodges was penalized by Mr. Correa for her honesty, because that report was true. And apparently the people who she singled out were very close to Mr. Correa. The corruption, to go back to your question, that characterizes not only the government of Ecuador, but all of the other 21st century socialist governments in the region, is unprecedented. I was ambassador to Venezuela. There was corruption in Venezuela. It was disgusting. The highest levels and the lowest levels and the middle levels of the Venezuelan government participated in it. It certainly is one of the reasons why somebody like Hugo Chavez came along. It's something that the political elites and the business elites in Latin America need to recognize. They are the ones who create the conditions for these demagogues to come in. But the demagogues, when they come in, are much worse. Much worse. Everything in the political world is relative, just like in the natural world. The only thing that is constant is the speed of light. At least this is what we think until another Einstein comes along. And in the political world, everything is relative, and relative to the corruption of, for example, of Venezuela in the 80s when I was there, the corruption under Chavez and Maduro is of astronomical proportions. Venezuela has had an income in the 15 years of Chavismo of 1 million times $1 million, 1 trillion. A trillion sounds like something very easy to pronounce. So let's say 1 million million. 40% of that has been stolen, according to people who have, banks and others who have studied it. So $400,000 million have been stolen by the Chavista government in Venezuela, from the Venezuelan people. The corruption in Ecuador hasn't reached those levels because Ecuador doesn't have that kind of an income. But the percentages, I would say, are probably very similar. Some of these anti-American actions, by the way, in Ecuador have been taken only by 2 other countries in the region to that level of magnitude, and that's, of course, Venezuela and Bolivia, in terms of expulsion of ambassadors and expelling USAID, expelling the anti-narcotics unit, something else that Correa has done, and just making it more difficult frankly, for the United States to conduct activities against organized crime and narcotics. Now we have to ask ourselves, why would somebody like Rafael Correa make it more difficult for the United States and Western countries to conduct anti-narcotics and anti-organized crime activities? Well, it could be that the answer lies in a number of other actions that have taken place since he's been in office. For example, in 2009, information contained in the computers captured by the Colombian army inside Ecuador at a camp run by the FARC, the Colombian FARC, a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group that has been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, Canada, European Union, showed that Mr. Correa had received financing in the presidential campaign of 2006 from the FARC and from drug traffickers linked to that organization. So this means that even before coming to power, Mr. Correa had links with drug traffickers, at least enough that they would contribute to his campaign. Various international agencies report that cocaine trafficking through Ecuador has increased in the last 6 years. Ecuador's government, however, manipulates public information by stating that it has increased seizures of drugs, for example, 42 tons in 2012 and 56 tons in 2013. But experts surmise that the drugs seized are only about 10 to 20% of that which passed through the country. So in any case, the seizure data confirm the growth of illegal traffic of narcotics in Ecuador. In 2010, the U.S. authorities said that at least 2010 alone, 302 drug ships departed Ecuador for Guatemala and Mexico loaded with drugs, of course, that would eventually make their way to the United States. In 2011, Jay Bergman, director of the Andean region of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, said that Ecuador was becoming a United Nations of organized crime, since drug traffickers from Albania, China, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and others use it as a platform to reach agreements with Andean cocaine smugglers and money laundering. The fact that Ecuador does have the U.S. dollar as its national currency makes it easier to hide financial transactions. The entire government, legislative and judiciary as well. And which, if he is, by the way, then Ecuador has ceased to be a democracy. Because in a democracy, the head of the executive branch cannot be the head of the other two branches, or you cease to be a democracy. So these are just some examples, very brief examples of the context in which the abuses that these gentlemen have outlined here today take place. Viewed from someone who has been in the U.S. government, has seen a lot of this evidence, but you don't have to be in the government to know what is going on in Ecuador. To reiterate the answer about the corruption, corruption is one of the common denominators of these so-called 21st century socialist states. Corruption is what feeds the illicit activity, and that keeps it in place by the purchase, frankly, of judges, of legislators, of police, investigators, prosecutors. The governments eventually stop working. Now you can say, all right, well then eventually they're going to fall from within. In some cases, we have found, in the case of some of these socialist, so-called socialist countries, like Cuba, that the government continues to corrode from the inside. Nothing works. A government like Cuba cannot feed its own people. It has to import 60% of its foodstuff. Venezuela imports 80% of its foodstuff. When they start running out of money, they simply cut back on the rations for the people. Venezuela is now experimenting with ration cards, obviously something that was done by Castro from the very first year that he was in power in Cuba. And yet Venezuela sits on top of the largest oil reserves in the world, according to many experts, if you count the heavy crude deposits in the Orinoco Basin. How can a country that sits on that mountain of wealth have shortages of 2 out of every 3 essential staples in the Venezuelan diet? That's what's happening today. The shortages affect 2 out of every 3 important elements in the Venezuelan diet, whether it's rice, cooking oil, meat, chicken, eggs, anything, practically anything that is necessary is in short supply. And the answer is corruption. The amount of money that has been stolen in these countries, I'm speaking plural, is, as I said before, is astronomical. And the reason they get away with it is because they destroy the institutions of a democracy. The press, they destroy the press so that the press cannot report these abuses. They take over the judiciary so that the judiciary is just another instrument of the executive branch. And nobody can take a corrupt official, for example, or an abusive policeman to court, because the judge will rule in favor of the government. That's why these countries don't work. Eventually, even Ecuador with its oil, even Venezuela with its oil, will begin to fall apart from the inside. The question then is, what do the countries in the region do? Unfortunately, most of the countries, including the United States, have decided to just step back and let the cards fall, let the house of cards fall down. I believe that this is not a moral position. It is not moral for the countries, the democracies of Latin America, to attend all these summits and all these conferences, or to sit at the OAS with countries like Venezuela and Ecuador and others that violate human rights and civil liberties and pretend that everything is all right, because they themselves, as we have seen in the case of Ecuador, Bolivia, and others, they themselves could fall prey to this ideology. And even if in a few years they will be over it, perhaps, certainly it didn't happen in the case of Cuba, the suffering and the regression in the development of these countries is too big a price to pay for the rest of the hemisphere to sit silent and do absolutely nothing. So I'm glad that that you all have had the opportunity to come and tell us what's going on in Ecuador. I know that the information here is not going to just stay in this room, because I know that the Inter-American Institute for Democracy will circulate it, and I know that a lot of people in Washington are doing what they can to counteract the lobbying, which is large, but it's not very effective. People simply don't believe the Maduros and the Correas and the others. And I think the one illustration of that was the pathetic reception that Mr. Correa received in the U.S. universities, where he spoke, where I spoke just this week. I talked to a professor at Yale who attended Mr. Correa's speech. He said he's been at Yale 30 years. He looked around the room. He didn't see a single person who he recognized as a member of the Yale community. They were all have been imported from the surrounding area. I guess to give Mr. Correa the feeling that somebody actually listens to what he has to say. So I'm happy to be here. I don't know if anybody has any questions. I'm happy to answer questions en español, si quieren. If not, congratulations.